Well, I read that a man searching for a perfect community of faith came to see Charles Spurgeon, the famous 19th century British preacher. Pastor Spurgeon reportedly told the man that there were many saintly people in his congregation, but a Judas could also be found among them. After all, Spurgeon noted, even Jesus had a traitor in the company of his disciples. The great preacher went on to point out that some in his church might be walking disobediently, as had been the case among believers at the earliest churches in Rome and Corinth and Galatia. The church is not the church you are looking for, said Spurgeon. But if you should happen to find such a church, I beg you not to join it, for you will spoil the whole thing. A funny thing about churches that they don't really teach in seminary is that, unlike most every other organization run by humans, a surprising number of people expect them to be perfect. No one goes to a golf club or a social club or a college or grocery store or a restaurant expecting perfection, but at church, it happens. Which is ironic, since churches are pretty upfront about going out of the way to bring in the imperfect, right? Not only are broken people invited and welcome, but life is messy. And even those not in a broken state can and do experience brokenness somewhere along the way. Life is messy. People are imperfect. Churches tend to be both. Expecting any place to be perfect is unusual. Expecting a church or faith community to be perfect is to misunderstand what faith communities are about. In the Gospels, the people we are told that Jesus helped and taught and brought into his fold all had very messy issues. His work was about loving others, flaws and all, by providing justice, kindnesses, while he humbly walked with God in community with others. That's what faith communities are still supposed to be about. The New Testament is not about providing a perfect place or perfect people or perfect leaders. The Old Testament is not about that either. The book of Micah in chapter 6 states there are only 3 things God requires of us. And not one of them is perfection. Not one of them is to be mistake-free. The 3 things are to seek justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. And that's what faith communities in the Judeo-Christian traditions are required to strive for. I sat down with today's lectionary text a few weeks back to see what might leap out at me for use today on Stewardship Sunday. And I was pleasantly surprised at how much connection this story about Hannah has to annual stewardship. The story takes place during the time of Hannah's family's trek to the house of God to make annual offerings to God. So that members of the house of God are feeling thankful and generous. Ideally, you think the day of offering would be pitched as going well for the person highlighted as giving, and that the other people who belong to the house of God would be perfect and nice to her, especially the leader of the faith community that she encounters there. See, we sort of expect a perfect, like, ethos pitch about the faith community at such a time. But that's not how the story is set up for poor Hannah. She's been led to believe by members and presumably some leaders of the faith that God's cursed her womb and made it barren, probably as some sort of punishment. We're also told that her co-wife, who is also a co-member of the faith, has been ruthlessly bullying her for being barren and cursed by God, and no doubt telling her she deserved it as some sort of form of punishment. And so Hannah, deep in sorrow and pain from lack of children and the bullying and mistakenly assuming God's disapproval, goes to the house of God in desperation, sobbing, weeping. God's house, she seeks refuge and help and understanding, and most of all, a child to end the bullying and terrible sense of worthlessness and shame that the culture has made her feel. the end of her road. Life for everyone is messy and sometimes terribly messy, and we find Hannah in just such a terrible state. But we also find her doing what we hope people in a dire situation will do: get to the house of God for refuge and help and understanding. But we learn that even there, life is messy, that faith communities are not perfect. First, Hannah seems to at last be in luck because Eli, the great high priest and judge, is there in the shadows, listening. We are sure he'll come to the rescue. But his first move is to fail her too. In fact, he fails pastoral care 101, treating her with disdain, mistaking her for being intoxicated and disrupted instead of a person in deep sorrow and despair. Like the rest of humankind, the religious leader, one of the greatest ever at that, is imperfect. If Eli and his community of faith are not perfect, no faith leader or faith community can be perfect. Nor should we expect them to be. Even so, the story's bottom line is God can and does work through faithful communities. The community doesn't have to be perfect to perfect God's work. Indeed, the in our face message is God works in and through imperfections, providing the members and leaders of the faith community who are seeking and providing help are sincere in their efforts to experience God and to provide experiences of God. And the sign of sincerity can be found in their gratitude and response to the faith community's actions as God's agents. Hannah is grateful, and she is content after Eli provides her with care and prayer and a blessing. It's not until later that she becomes pregnant. She's no longer sad and begins to eat before then too. She makes her promise of offerings to God before then as well. And the offerings are not payments for answers to prayers, but for the goodness and the promise of goodness provided by God's presence in and through a faith community. Hannah's responses are not just to get things, but to facilitate the existence of goodness and the promise of goodness, the seeking of justice and loving of kindness, humbly walking with God. You see, offerings make the community of faith possible, and the goodness and the promises and the experiences of God in and through you. Offerings create a place where God's presence can be experienced in sight and sound and word and deed, and thus even in people of faith, as flawed as they might be. The past few weeks we've heard and read about the many ministries and missions of this faith community, the goodnesses and promise of goodnesses provided by God's presence in and through it. And they exist because members and friends of this faith community have been and are sincere in their efforts to experience God and to provide experiences of God. The sign of sincerity is found in all of our gratitude and responses to Mount Vernon First Congregational Church's actions as God's agents and God's presence here. And we always show such sincerity to be a part of God's work and be in God's presence. All of that matters much, as do